Kia ora tātou, ngā mihi o te wā kia koutou katoa. Hei, e te atu kaharawa, he whakamoemiti tēnei ki a koe. O mai tō koro wai aroha I rungu I tēnei rōpū I tēnei wā. Kia piki te ora, kia piki te kaha, kia tātou katoa. I te mutunga o mātou kōrero I tēnei ahi, kia whiwhi hua. Kia piki te ora o a rātou tamariki I mui a tātou I tēnei wā. E nei whakaro I rungu I te ingo o tau tama uihu kaiti. Āmini.
Āmini.
Kia ora, Laura. We've also joined by a very, very capable group of panellists who are going to be sharing with us shortly. We have Robin Zink from Enviro Schools Otago, Rachel Baldstead from NZCER, and Barney our NZEI member who's involved with both Te Reo Ariari and Aranui Tō Tamaki Makoto. Tonight's hui is, from an NZEI perspective, it is us starting the work that we need to do around the whittle that climate change has laid out there for us. As you will have heard, the government is currently consulting on their emissions reduction plan. The ERP, as it is affectionately known, is essentially going to be the body of work that is going to be aligning with next year's budget, that is going to be setting out what the approach is, where the money's coming from, and how it is going to ensure as a country we are lowering emissions in accordance with our contribution to the Paris Agreement. We know that educators play a really important role in that conversation, and so we're immensely disappointed to see that we've hardly been included in the current draft document. And so within that is probably our greatest opportunity, the opportunity for us to crystallise our voice around advocating for the important role that educators do play in the climate change movement, and to make sure that we're laying out a really clear plan, not just for what we need in terms of teaching and learning, but also what is the role of schools and early childhood centres as trusted community institutions within their community. And so the purpose of tonight is to kickstart that conversation. We're going to be hearing from our panellists soon. Afterwards, there will be a chance for a Q&A. And then finally, we are going to spend a short amount of time in breakout rooms, which we'll explain later, before we then take you through how we're going to be approaching the formulating of our submission. And so I'm now going to move us into our panellist discussion. And our first panellist that we have up today is going to be Robin Zink from Enviro Schools Otago. Kia ora, Robin. I'll pass over to you.
Kia ora, Liam. Thank you very much for that lovely welcome. Ko Robin Zink toka ingoa, no Aotearoa and ko Enviro Schools Regional Coordinator o tākou tuku mahi. So I've been working with a group of energy experts in Otago, supporting schools to transition from coal to more sustainable energy sources for their heating. Currently in Aotearoa we have about 225 schools that have coal boilers, another 585 that use gas and oil to heat the schools. And these schools encompass about 143,000 students, where they're attending schools that are using fossil fuels for heating, which, as Liam pointed out, the country has ambitions to be carbon zero, and the fossil fuel use in schools contradicts that somewhat. So the government has stated the state sector will be decarbonised by 2025, yet has only committed $50 million to fund 90 schools to transition to more sustainable energy by 2023. And thus far, as part of that process, have only managed to replace 14 boilers. This will hopefully start speeding up, but as you can see, the current budget is far short of what will be needed to replace all school fossil fuel boilers. And I think moving schools off fossil fuels, especially coal, has become even more important in these COVID times, as air pollution created through burning fossil fuels disproportionately impacts on children and people of lower socioeconomic groups and those with chronic health conditions. So funding the replacement of boilers is beyond the means of individual schools, and it's not the responsibility of individual schools. And it's really clear to be, it's really important to be clear that replacing fossil fuel boilers in schools is a government responsibility. And we need to keep the pressure on the government to make replacing fossil fuel boilers at schools a priority that needs to be urgently funded. So what the things we can do around that, we can obviously lobby our local MPs, and we can also get on board with the fossil-free schools campaign that's been spearheaded by 350 Aotearoa currently. This is a campaign run in coalition with NZEI and PPTA and a number of other groups. You can find out about that campaign on their website, and there's lots of resources and ideas for students and teachers to lobby the government for additional funding. But educators have a really important contribution to make in creating and supporting a just transition to a low emissions future. As Liam said, that our role is virtually invisible in the ERP, and I'll just mention a couple of things around energy that teachers can do. And so one is get students really excited about energy, and energy is more than just physics. For those of you involved with Enviro schools, you might recognise some of these key points here. Schools are full of real life learning opportunities about energy. Energy flows through all our living systems. It's an opportunity again to see how where everything is interdependent and connected, and energy is a way of helping us understand that. Our use of energy has.
Robin, sorry to interrupt. Can I just get you to adjust your microphone a bit so that people can hear you?
Oh, sorry. Is that any better?
Amazing. Yep, that sounds stunning.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, energy, obviously how we use energy has impacts on our world. So schools are a fabulous place to do energy audits, look at our energy and travel. The photo here is from a local school that we're looking at energy used in their school and their community for heating and the impacts they had on the air quality in their school. And of course, we can enjoy the abundance of energy while using different forms of energy, which helps us to think about energy in the context of that just transition. So just, I guess the key points are that we need to lobby government for more funding, and when we're thinking about energy in relation to education, it's thinking about it in that really holistic context. So, thank you very much.
Kia ora, Robin, thank you for sharing that. I guess one of the things that came out really strongly there were two things. One is the amazing learning opportunities that this whole piece of work creates for educators, and that's stuff that we get naturally. The other part though was around the partnership role that government's got to do alongside schools and early childhood centres, which often tends to run up against that Tomorrow Schools model that we've got where they wipe their hands off it. But we're just talking about numbers that are just far too large for any local community to be able to run. So thank you very much for that. That was really useful. I'm now going to invite our second panellist on. We've got Rachel Baldstead from NZCR. Kia ora, Rachel.
Kia ora, Liam. Kia ora, Robin. Thanks for opening us up for our panel today. I want to offer a few ideas to help us think about the role that we as educators can play in Aotearoa New Zealand's climate response. So education has a role to play in emissions reduction, but more broadly, we have a role to play in supporting a socially just transition to a low emissions and climate change future. Now, globally, there's a big conversation happening about how education should respond to the climate crisis. Young people have been central in demanding that climate change be a core aspect of their learning. And educators and teacher unions have also stepped into this space, recognising the urgency. Research tells us that in many countries, including Aotearoa, there's a policy gap between climate action policy and education policy. So education gets talked about in climate action policy, but there isn't a clear line of sight to education sector policies that would support and empower education to fully realise its potential to be part of the climate transition. The emissions reduction plan talks about education, as Liam has said, but currently what's there is a bit of a grab bag of stuff, and you do have to go looking for it. And it's hard to see ourselves in this plan, and that's not good enough. Now, we do know that there are already some fantastic things happening in our sector. Yes, there are opportunities in our curriculum. Yes, there are programs and resources for schools that choose to make sustainability and climate change a focus. And yes, there are some developments around school property and infrastructure. But very often, where fantastic things are happening, it's because of the vision and commitment of passionate teachers and school leaders, students and their communities, and it's not systemic. And what we don't have yet is a coherent, joined up climate change vision and strategy for the education sector. And until recently, this was pretty much true everywhere in the world. But at COP26, just 2 weeks ago, some countries' ministers of education made significant pledges and commitments. For example, the UK Secretary of Education has announced a draft strategy that talks about, includes teacher training and support, focus on school property, pathways to green jobs, and so on. And you might want to look at this strategy as you think about your ERP submissions. What do you think a strategy for climate education in Aotearoa, New Zealand would need to look like? And there's certainly some things that are missing from the UK strategy. It's not strong around climate justice, for example. I'm sure that we here in Aotearoa could have something even more visionary and deeply grounded in what we value. So it's important that as a sector, we can see ourselves in the ERP. The ERP talks about education in terms of behaviour change, but we know education is so much more than this. Education for a changing climate also needs to go beyond just learning about the problem and its causes and consequences. Quality education for a changing climate and for a socially just transition to a low emissions future needs to be holistic. It needs to be shaped in partnership with young people, communities, and educators. And it needs to create opportunities for action and opportunities to rethink and reshape our relationship to the environment and to each other. It needs to reflect and build on our cultural strengths and knowledge. And it needs to empower young people and communities to be active participants in revisioning and reshaping our society. It needs to ensure that no one is left behind. So we need to see all these things clearly signalled in New Zealand's climate action policies and plans, including the ERP. The transition to a low emissions future is not just a scientific or economic or technological transition. It's also a social and cultural transition. And that's why it's so important that the education sector's voice is strong in these plans. And it's important that we're consistent in our messaging. Ngā mihi nui.
Kia ora, Rachel, that was fantastic. Can I just double check, did you say the UK have got a relatively comprehensive strategy?
Yeah, so there's a link in the chat. I just put a blog yesterday about that, and that contains links to that. So yeah, it's a strategy. It's well worth having a look at. And I think it's probably the first of its kind in terms of, making a clear stance about education's contribution to climate.
We're talking about Boris Johnson's UK.
We are.
Holy.
Yeah.
What a world. One thing that struck a chord listening to you there was around the fact that we do have good examples of things happening in the education sector, but we just don't have the scale to the level where it's systemic. And I'm assuming that's reflected in the fact that we've got about 70 people that have gone out of their way in an evening to come and talk about climate change education. but we don't actually have that happening at scale across the entire profession. Also, one question, because I know that you've been writing these really, really easy to understand blog posts for busy educators around climate issues. Where do people go and find those?
I think someone's just popped the links in the chat, but if you can't find the links, you can go to the nzcer.org.nz website and look for our blogs, or look for our research project, which is called Education Policy and Practice for a Changing Climate.
Cool. Awesome. Oh, thanks very much, Rachel. We'll catch you back during the Q&A. Our next panellist to share is Barney Manai, a good friend of mine in NZI Aotearoa, and looking forward to hearing you share, Barney, and I've got so much confidence in you, I don't even have a bell. You have to take yourself off mute, Barney.
Oh, tēnā koe, Liam. Ngā mihi nui kia koe reo Loris, mo te karakia hei whakahonotia te timata o tēnei kaupapa whakaire hira. My name is Barney Manai. I'm Ngāti Apakura, Ngāti Maniapoto and Ngāti Awa. If you have a look at the slides, and I'm not sure if the slides are being shown at the moment, up at the top right-hand corner, you'll see our marae kahotea. Our marae, we take kaitiakitanga seriously. And if you can see there, it says there's a kōrero there that says te toto o te tangata he kai, te oranga o te tangata he whenua. While the food provides the blood in our veins, our health is drawn from the land. And we don't claim ownership to the land. We feel we belong to the land. So we see Papa Tūnuku, the land, as something to be respected and be looked after. So in our marae, the wharekai that you see there that doesn't have solar panels on, does have solar panels on now. And behind that, next to our marae over there is a new building. So that's a little bit out of date, but the whole idea behind that is that it gave you a view of kahotea marae and how we look at our maunga and how we feel about the land. Now, Papa Tūnuku, if we move on to the second slide, you'll see there's a few things there that we've noted. Since 2015, there's been a Paris Agreement, which has resulted in some pretty strong promises from the Crown. And another thing we take pretty seriously is the treaty. And under Article 2, it is about protecting our taonga. It is about protecting our skies, our land, our waters, and our maunga and our whenua. And as you can see in there, they've made some pretty strong promises about reducing the carbon print, about reducing the use of fossil fuels, and about reducing it. However, in the 3 years, there's been at least 3 cases of people taking the Crown to court over those issues of not honouring the treaty. I think that was done by Mike Smith, but there was a young lawyer from Hamilton who also took New Zealand to court over the fact that they've done very little in progressing those promises made back in 2015. Now, what do you think is one of the issues that I find is the problem is that our minister is actually a minister outside cabinet. Now, I'm not sure about you, but on our marae, if someone's sitting on their marae ātea and not coming into our hui, they're manuhiri. And so I'm wondering why such a responsible position is a minister outside of cabinet. And I'm wondering just how much influence and progress, well, I know how much influence they made. Have a look at the decision made by Megan Wood about not giving new permits to the searching of gas exploration and new fossil fuels. Now, that to me was an absolute no. If you have a look at what they came in on their campaign in, and I'm just going to flick down to another one, down to 4, they promised, and this is the thing, they promised to decarbonise the public sector. They promised to work with farmers, and they're starting to do that. But if you read the report, you'll see that there's a lot of potential in there. But a bit like the scorecard, the performance is really a D, because we haven't seen a lot of progress and movement in that area, and we haven't seen a lot of progress. And you've just illustrated some of the issues happening in education. Lots of fantastic things happening in the environment school space, and lots of things happening, I know as an iwi, in our relationship building with councils, like Waipa Council. I know we're doing a fair bit of riparian planting in that area, and we're doing a fair bit of work with other groups like Forest and Birds, and a fair bit of work with the Waipa Council in general in progressing the issues that we see important, and that's bringing back our native trees, bringing back our birds, and bringing back the tuna that used to be in the wetlands. Just down from our marae was a place, is a private industry that's building a new dairy company. And you might think, okay, these are outside private people, but we've had far more progress in getting them to build a wetland, in getting them to actually change their dairy farm that day and turn it into plans for a horticultural farm, and also sponsoring a cycleway and a bicycle way for Otorohanga. And I know the Mayor, Max Baxter, is really happy about that, and he also sits, and so are we, because we are also in partnership with him. And that's just one thing that's happening in our little space. But can you imagine if all iwis are working in that sort of kaitiakitanga framework, kaitiakitanga hinengaro, how much that one little raindrop, when put together, can drive the huge turbine and push against hydraulic power, and create hydro power that will give us all the things we need in terms of progressing this issue of climate change. So what are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about the collective energy, the collective voice. And we shouldn't be leaving it to our youth to march and get angry. We should be standing with them. And the union voice, along with private enterprise and along with some of the new developers, like the Winton one in Papakura, and have a look online and you'll see some fantastic stuff being proposed there. Electric buses, more walkways, more cycleways, things like that will actually get us thinking and prioritising mahimara gardens within our own backyard. I'm just going to say that in terms of the performance of New Zealand, I think the Crown, they need a hand up. And I think we are perfectly placed to do that. Iwi are taking this very seriously, and we're actually challenging. I know Maniapoto has challenged every agency, all 20 of them, to produce and have agency agreements with our tribe. That's part of our treaty agreement. And we're challenging them because we do not feel they're trying hard enough. And we do not feel that there's enough going on in the Crown leadership style to actually deliver on the promises they're making for the 2030. I know that sounds a little bit harsh, but if you go back straight to the last one where I've said Modi to Modi order, and there's a picture of the casino drowning, and there's a couple of other things, things flooding. One of the issues that we have got right now, and a real important issue, is what do we do about our biggest industries like New Zealand Steel and Genesis, who burn coal, and they burn it to produce energy for us. I know Fonterra has taken out their coal boiler out of the Te Awamutu Dairy Company, because Ngāti Apakura Trust that I sit on has asked them and is also talking to them about plans in the horticultural space. I'm wondering why Z Fuel, when it was published, produces 3 times more carbon than any other fuel company. So I think those are things that we, as a group, should be challenging in on. Have a look at the Emissions Trade Authority list And C, I understand they now have to report on what they do in that space. How are they going to respect Ranginui and Papatūānuku? The last thing I'd like us to do think about is how we prioritise climate change as kaitiaki. And that is not just a Māori thing. It is that everybody should be in that space. And I know principals of primary schools, I know there are people that have taken that on board. I just want to say this, that if we can, as a group, work in that space and work together, we will do really well. I want to leave you with this a particular experience that I had with my moko manawa. One day we were out walking and we're doing what we called hikoi, picking up litter around the neighbourhood. He called it Tiaki Papatūānuku. And while doing this, a large adult, pretty big guy, bigger than me, dropped his cigarette packet in front of him. And he looked up and he said to him, "What are you doing?" And the guy sort of looked at my little moko and a puzzled face, and he questioned, "Who's this little kid?" You know, I could read his questioning my authority. And then seeing his bag, a rubbish bag, he picked it up and he put it in Manawa's bag. You know, sometimes big nations and important people need those small voices, those small visual reminders of what is right and why we're doing this. In the Indigenous eyes of their kaumātua, that will give them that, what we call hinatori, the glimmer of hope, the strengthening of that Indigenous lens thinking, so that as a group, he waka ike noa, we can achieve anything together. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora, Barney. There were a number of things that stood out for me from that kōrero, and the first one was just around a lot of the examples that you gave were local examples where clearly people were getting alongside iwi and the importance of that relationship. Is that a key step, or is that just coincidental?
No, it's a key strategic step. We're working with people like Don Scarlett from he's the chairperson of Forest Birds Protection. You know, these who have, we've got partnerships. I know Graham's online from Waipaha Council there. People of that nature, mayors of Otorohanga, mayor of Waipaha Council, Jim Milquist, Mayor Max Baxter, who incidentally sits on the Three Waters thing. And we're also working pretty closely with key people in various committees and various groups to make sure that we're all on the same page and that we're not overlapping in our or overreaching in our things. I happen to sit on the JMA which is a joint management group for Waipaha River, so I've got the opportunity to actually talk to the right people.
The other part that stood out was what I heard a lot of around building our thinking off Indigenous knowledge, and even that simple comment that you made around that idea of not owning land but coming from the land. It's small but powerful ideas like that really change our mindset around us collectively as humanity needing to better fall into balance between people and land.
That is something we've got that opportunity as teachers to embed in the curriculum in at primary, kohanga reo, whether it's mainstream or not. We have that opportunity, and I would implore all those teachers and even those people out in the community to really embed that sort of thinking within our rangatahi, our tamariki, and even in our colleagues. So that we're not feeling like it's an us and them thing, it's an us and us thing.
Kia ora, Barney. We'll come back to you shortly for the Q&A. I see Ben's busy in the chat, encouraging people to pop questions into the chat. We're going to be moving through to that Q&A shortly. I've also seen Tina Smith, the president of the TEU, and Joe Brunskill from PPTA. Welcome, it's great to have you two here. We've got one more slide coming up, which picks up on four kind of key themes that we have seen running through this conversation so far. And I was just going to talk to the last one around the conversation that we've been having by and large is around talking about the emission reduction plan inside of the education sector. I wanted to expand that slightly to talk more broadly about a just transition and the need for both government and business to make sure that they have genuine engagement with working people. There it is, kia ora, Conor. And so we talk about that concept as a just transition, and where we tend to see it so much right now in a New Zealand context is the work that is taking place in Taranaki. And so you'll all be aware that when Labour was first elected, they put an end to the reissuing of oil and gas exploration. There's some caveats around that, but broadly speaking. And so what they were signalling at the time was that the Taranaki regional economy was going to have to move to a low carbon economy. And when you've got such a high proportion of jobs that are there because of the oil and gas industry, either we develop a plan that is going to bring new industry, new low carbon industry to Taranaki, or we're just going to end up with what we saw in the 1980s in New Zealand when we had a massive economic reshift, and we're just going to see working people turfed out. Quite often we hear from educators around why is it that we should be worried about what's going on in oil and gas in Taranaki? And put simply, our jobs, our existence relies on having the population base. We know that in education, we're not the first line responders for the need for a just transition, but we very much are the second one, because those working families are the same families that attend our schools and our kura and our early childhood centres. And so a just transition is around putting a plan in place. It links into that climate justice that we heard from Rachel about making sure that those people that haven't caused the need to move to the low carbon economy, they're not the ones that are bearing the cost of doing so. The government has made some good broad policy decisions in that space. They are yet to surface yet, but ideas like social insurance and fair pay agreements, these all allow working people access to better terms and conditions, which will create space for them to be able to retrain or transition to other industries, ideally green industries. This concept of a just transition is being put into action all around the world, and they typically talk about the tripartite relationship between government, business and unions. In our New Zealand context, we know we've got a really important fourth partner there, iwi, and what we need to get better at as a country is creating space for that social dialogue to come ahead, because like what is happening in the climate education space, we've got examples of it, but it is certainly not systemic. And so the four key points that you've got there really are the kind of four cornerstones of what we think a submission to the ERP from an education perspective needs to look like. Shortly, we're going to be moving into breakout rooms and you're going to have your chance to get involved in that conversation. But before we do that, we are going to jump to a couple of questions for our panelists. If we could have all of our panelists up on the screen at once, because I'm just going to ask these all to the group. Rachel, since you've popped up on my screen first, I've just got a question around the curriculum refresh. The Ministry of Education have said that over the next 5 years, we're going to be doing a small refresh, which looks like a rewrite of the curriculum. Currently, where is climate education sitting in the big plan?
I think that's a really good question. I don't think I hold the answer to that, but I think there is a really important opportunity with the curriculum refresh to ensure that there's a much clearer, stronger commitment to climate and sustainability education than we see in our current curriculum. So, you know, I mean, COVID has had such an impact on so many things, including pushing out some of our emissions reduction planning in New Zealand. And it's similarly pushed out the timeframes a little bit for the NZC refresh. And I think that's a good thing. That allows us to really mobilise as a sector and get some really clear, strong and consistent messages around what we think climate change education Aotearoa needs to look like, so that that can feed into this curriculum refresh process. I believe we'll be seeing the vision statements and the social sciences draft coming out early next year. And so this is another, so we look beyond our scrambling to get our submissions in for the ERP. We need to think about how we feed into and give feedback on that NZC refresh content as it's coming out. I mean, to make sure that the opportunity isn't lost to elevate climate education.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if there's support in the chat for people wanting to engage in a separate conversation around climate education in terms of the curriculum refresh, because my sense is that there's a real opportunity there to be very clear and explicit around our vision inside of a national curriculum for the role that climate education needs to play. I think it was Barney who referenced the huge amount of pressure that are coming from young people who rightly so are demanding that this is a part of how they're transitioning through schools. I've got another question here. How can educators get active on the school boiler issue? I might kick over to you, Robin.
I think there's a whole range of things educators can do. As I said.
Can you adjust your microphone again?
Oh, okay. Is that better?
Yep.
Yep. So one is lobbying local MPs and also local councils, because they can influence decisions around air quality in particular. So lobbying your local council for that, and obviously local council also lobby national government, but lobbying your MP is a really important thing. Get on board with that, the fossil-free campaign, fossil-free schools campaign that's been spearheaded by 350 Aotearoa at the moment. And as I said, they've got lots of great resources that teachers and students can use to raise awareness around the issues. And we just need to keep that pressure on the government to ensure that they increase the level of funding available to schools so they can transition off fossil fuels.
Kia ora, Robin. I'll ask somebody in the tech team to pop a link to that fossil-free state sector resources. Before we move on though, Robin, can you explain your background to us? It's really interesting.
Oh, my background on screen. So this is a resource we use in Enviro schools. It's got a very wonderful name called The Big Picture, and we use it to stimulate sustainability and getting people to look at what's happening in this picture that suggests to them that this is a sustainable, healthy, just community, and there's lots of references to energy in here, so it's also a really fabulous tool to use to get stimulate people's thinking about energy. Oh,
cool, thank you. Loris has jumped up on the screen as well. We will need to be co-facilitating this Q&A, but I'm just taking over. So Loris, instead I'm going to ask you a question around the Maramataka, because we're starting to see that more and more in use across schools. It's very much a live conversation for us inside of the Aotearoa. Are you able to talk about how into climate education?
Actually, as Barney said, in the whole, this all works together in the same way. So Maramataka, while we use it very much about trying to reference it to the Gregorian calendar, actually it isn't about that. It is very much about Papatūānuku and how we as people relate to Papatūānuku. So the Maramataka is very much worked out according to high energy levels, which is very much about the moon and the phases that's in, but it also relates to the sea, the rivers, everything interacts, and that's what makes it super interesting that we as NZD Aotearoa are actually thinking about thinking about and actually very much in the process of changing to a Maramataka. So starting our planning earlier in the year so that when we come to Matariki, we are ready to roll with what is actually happening for the rest of the year. So energizing ourselves around Matariki and then start into the rest of the year. Exciting stuff because it actually fits very much with our kōrero about climate change as well. Climate change, as Rere Atamaki says, is climate. And climate is Maramataka.
Kia ora, Loris. Barney, the next question's for you. We're talking a lot in NZI Te Reo around moku te ao. How does moku te ao align with our aspirations for climate change?
Well, moku te ao in its purest sense is the world is your oyster, I guess where I would think of it. You know, it is, so in terms of Maramataka, Rangimokai actually has some great recordings of himself in the Matariki space. And Matariki really is about celebrating and giving affirmations to the way we treat Papatūnuku and the way we read Ranginui and the way we interact with our oceans, our rivers and our sea and our streams and lakes. Sorry. So really, in a sense, moku te ao is that potential opportunity that we have as people to give some breath and life to curriculum documents like Te Takanga o Te Wā, which was brought out a few years ago and is gathering dust around, where it actually invites local hapu and mana whenua to actually share their kōrero and their stories about what could be achieved within their particular areas of the schools. In terms of the environment, it's about me changing my mind of thinking about how I travel, how I eat, how I live, and what types of interaction I do when it comes to respecting Papatūnuku and Ranginui. That's how I see it. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Barney. And I've got more than enough questions here, and so I might not be able to get to them all. Rachel, are you able to unpack a little bit more about the UK's new climate education strategy? Is it purely science focused? Are there any transdisciplinary goals or advice in it?
It's not just science focused. It's the strategy. It doesn't go into heaps of detail about curriculum aspects. I saw the question popped up in the chat is, is there anything that's innovative about the strategy? I think the most innovative thing about it is that there is a strategy and that it's clearly an attempt to be a sort of whole system education strategy. My understanding is that there's going to be some further kind of consultation and engagement with the education sector and with young people on the strategy. So, I think we don't even have a strategy here. And so the opportunity for our education sector and for our young people and for our communities to feed into and co-create an education sector strategy on climate change currently doesn't exist. So yeah, to me, that's the most innovative thing. And probably the other thing is that it's being owned at a pretty high level by the Secretary of Education. So he's kind of holding responsibility for this, and having that kind of ministerial commitment, I think actually does go quite a long way for actions to be followed through and to have some accountability.
Kia ora. The last question we've got, I'll get all panelists and Loris to respond to, and this will probably be the last one before we head into breakout rooms. What would you personally like to see from the government's emission reduction plan? We'll kick off with Robin, we'll go Rachel, Barney, and finish with Loris. Robin, over to you.
I think following this conversation, a lot more focus on education and a lot more input from young people.
Kia ora, Robin. Rachel?
Sorry, what was the question again?
What would you personally like to see from the government emission reduction plan.
Yeah, I think a coherent view on the role and contribution of education.
Cool. Barney?
I'd like to see more recognition of Indigenous and Pasifika ideas and how they can come to the table and be valued. So that's how I really think our kura would be able to get involved.
I would like the government to actually explain to us what a co-designed plan is that is tiriti based, so that they come out with real example and says, this is what it is, this is what it looks like, or alternatively, listen to what we have to say about that.
Kia ora. I think within those last 4 comments, we've got the makings of a really good submission.